Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I wanted to start by just sort of apologising to you all for the delay in making this video. It is a very busy time of year, as I'm sure you're all aware, and I had a number of factors come into play. I've been in Japan for the past couple of weeks, and that was a very exciting experience. I had my first international speaking debut, which was super exciting. Before that, I actually had tonsillitis and I was almost hospitalised. So anyway, we are here. None of that matters, we are here. And today we are going to be talking about the diagnosis process. Now, this might be a bit of a touchy issue for people, and I'm very aware that, some of this video is my own beliefs, my own experiences, but I'm certainly not trying to push those beliefs on you. I'm trying to present a very even-handed argument of particularly why you should or shouldn't get your child diagnosed, and I've sort of tried to brainstorm all of the factors that I can think of that might affect that decision-making process. Now, I've broken this video up into segments of who, what, when, why, and where you should get your child diagnosed, or should think about getting your child diagnosed if that's your final decision. But it is really important to note that this is your decision. Ultimately, it's your choice. I'm just trying to present all the information and make that available to you. So we'll jump right in. Hope you enjoy the video. Let's get started. So first up, I want to talk about who can actually diagnose dyslexia. It's best to get diagnosed by an educational psychologist. They can give really comprehensive reports and have a wide scale of tests that they can do. You can also be diagnosed by a speech pathologist and I think some forms of occupational therapists as well. But in terms of getting accommodations for Year 12 exams and things like that, it's really important that you're diagnosed by an educational psychologist. Now, one of the main questions a lot of parents ask me is, when should I get my child diagnosed? And it's really a choice, and we'll talk about this in the why section as well. I think most people tend to be diagnosed around Year 4 and then get a reassessment done around Year 10. That's sort of the common timing I would recommend, I guess. Much before Year 4, they sort of say it's a little bit too early to diagnose dyslexia. They might do a full assessment and say, look, there's strong indications that this child might be dyslexic, but they're not, we can't necessarily provide a formal diagnosis because it might just be a developmental delay. And the reason you have to get that assessment redone at a Year 10 level is for accommodations. So it's also kind of good to have a bit of an update because, as we know, the brain changes over time. So it's really important that you're aware of perhaps new things that have come into play, new problems or new strengths even that have come into play later on in life. Now, as you guys know, I was diagnosed officially at age 15. And it's important to remember that I was sort of aware that I was likely to be dyslexic up until that time. But for me, until I had that sort of concrete reason to hold on to, that yes, I have a piece of paper that, says that I have dyslexia, it sort of did hurt my self-esteem a little bit. I think that was because I sort of thought, well, what if this isn't actually true? I don't have a concrete piece of evidence to support that I actually am dyslexic. And it also made me feel a little bit more isolated because I knew that I wasn't normal, so I couldn't really connect with my peers, but I also knew that, I didn't have something necessarily telling me officially that I could fit in with these dyslexic people. So I think when you're thinking about when to diagnose your child, really think about how it's impacting them currently emotionally. Is it impacting on their self-esteem? And if it is, I think that's time to go and get that diagnosis. Now, one of the other big questions is, where should you get your child diagnosed? This is really a personal preference thing. I personally got diagnosed by SPELD, which is sort of the peak body around dyslexia. They advise the government and things like that. So they're sort of the major sort of governing body on dyslexia. I was diagnosed there. It's important to note that it was quite expensive. To put a figure on it, I think it was around $1,300. That's sort of going to be pretty consistent across the board for any educational psychologist report, but the report is very comprehensive. It's you know, a very thick report. I should have brought it out for you guys, but it's a very thick report, and it doesn't just outline the problems or say that you're diagnosed with dyslexia. It actually maps out all of your strengths as well, and basically tells you what percentiles you're in comparison to your peers. So it's a really, really helpful report, very, very, very comprehensive, but also quite expensive. Now, I'm not necessarily recommending Spelled and saying that, you know, that's the only way to get diagnosed. There are many other educational psychologists that work out of private practice, or there might be someone closer in your area, but that's just who I was diagnosed with, and I had quite a good experience with them. So what does the actual diagnosis process look like? Well, it's quite lengthy. The one that I had done at Spelled was actually 5 hours long. Okay, that's not going to be the same everywhere. I've heard of people having, you know, maybe a 1 hour testing session, something like that, but mine was actually more of a half a day thing with breaks in between, but really quite a long and very fatiguing process. Now, what they do in the actual assessment is they measure your IQ, and that might be with an IQ test, it might be with a WISC, and many other tests that measure sort of your base level of intelligence. And then they're going to do a whole lot of assessments around reading, writing and spelling skills, more specifically around phonological awareness, because that's what we're testing with dyslexia. Now, to give you a few examples of what some of the tests might look like, there are some ones around really quick letter recognition. So they might hold up a letter and say, what's this, what's this? And you have to say A, B, C, whatever. It's obviously not in order, but really quick letter recognition. There might be some rhyming exercises. There might be some reading of like nonsensical words, so words that aren't actually words, but seeing how you can actually break down and decode that word. There might be some reading speed tests, so reading in your head, you know, and timing you, how fast can you read. There might be some writing speed tests, so you know, how fast can you copy these letters. And all of those sort of things are compared to a range of criteria that are sort of measured against where your age group should sort of be, where your ability should be in comparison to your age. And what they're actually doing is they're comparing those specific reading, writing, spelling skills to your IQ. And if those things don't match up, then they might look at a diagnosis of dyslexia. The tests sort of get more and more specific as you go along in the process, but I hope that sort of gives you an idea of what it's like. Now, to give you a bit of an insight into my experience of the diagnosis process, obviously I was 15 years old, but I actually broke down and cried during my assessment and had to take another break, and that was mainly because I mean, it was due to fatigue as well, because, you know, you're doing basically all the tests that are your biggest weaknesses, and that's a very, very fatiguing process. You're doing a lot of thinking during that time. But I also broke down at a specific point, and it was when I was asked to, I think we're doing some reading comprehension tests, and I was reading out basically a prep level book that was literally talking about how this bird was making a nest or something really kind of patronizing like that, and I had to read this book aloud and then answer some questions afterwards. And for me, you know, up until the age of 15, I've built in all my own coping mechanisms, and you know, when I do reading comprehension, I read the questions first and then look for the answers in the text. I never actually end up reading the whole text. And so this time I was a bit stuck because he was actually testing my raw reading comprehension. And so I'm reading this book aloud about this, you know, bird making a nest. It was the most simple thing in the world, and I closed the book and I realized that I'd been focusing so hard on trying to read out loud correctly that I had absorbed none of the information whatsoever. And so he asked me a very, very simple question like, what color was the bird or whatever, and I just had no idea. And you know, when you know that you're reading at a really low level, that's, you know, not in any way related to your age, currently, it's really, really heartbreaking. And it was a bit of a hurtful moment for me, I guess, because it just really reminded me that I wasn't at that level that my peers were at, and that this was a real issue for me. So keep in mind how fatiguing and also how sort of emotionally challenging this diagnosis process can be, and that might also be a factor in your decision-making process. You know, is this actually going to maybe cause more harm than good? Is it going to disrupt their sort of emotional well-being? So if you're interested, the other way that they sort of have to diagnose dyslexia is by looking at 4 criteria from this big psychological diagnosing book called the DSM-5, and you have to actually cover all 4 criteria to be diagnosed. So really quickly, the first criteria is really important. It's about having a targeted intervention for at least 6 months, with receiving no real sort of improvement in those skills, like they haven't caught up to their peers despite that 6 months of intervention. So that might be some sort of evidence-based reading and writing program to try and catch them up, but they haven't done so. That's the first criteria. The second criteria talks about having a more plausible explanation for why they might be struggling in those areas of reading, writing and spelling. So have they had a hearing impairment? Have they lived overseas and English is their second language? Something like that, that sort of provides a bit of a reason about why that reading, writing process might have been disrupted. The third criteria basically says that these issues in reading, writing, spelling must have become apparent in the early years of schooling. So, you know, in the primary years of schooling. And then the final criteria talks about basically their reading, writing, spelling ability does not match the performance of their peers or where they're expected to be at. So those are the 4 criteria that they have to diagnose according to, and you have to have covered all 4 for a diagnosis. So now we get down to the really nitty-gritty. Why should you go through this diagnosis process with your child? Well, I'm going to provide 2 different perspectives, some sort of ideas for yes and some ideas for no, and I'm not advocating any way, but I've just sort of brainstormed as much as I can for both yes and no, and I'm going to present you with my thoughts. On the yes column, I think naming it can provide a sense of relief for that child, because it really does provide them with a concrete reason as to why they think that way, and that they're not actually stupid or lazy or any of those things. Secondly, it can really improve their self-esteem if they know that there's an actual reason and that they're actually not stupid. Again, that sort of helps them more emotionally. The third reason is quite important, and that's that they can apply for accommodations. You can't get accommodations without a diagnosis, so if you're looking to go through VCE or any of those pathways, you need to have a diagnosis. One of the other really important things is that when you have a diagnosis of dyslexia, you can claim certain legal grounds. So as we know, it's a learning disability, so it comes under things like Disability Discrimination Act and things like that. And it also means that the school are more likely to act in favour of your child if you have that diagnosis, because if you're diagnosed with a disability, a learning disability, they have certain legal requirements that they have to provide. The other thing is that if they have that diagnosis of dyslexia, a bit like I was saying before with my story, they can really go out and connect with other dyslexic individuals, and I think that's a really, really important thing to have. If they don't have a diagnosis but they're sort of aware that they might be dyslexic, a bit like I was, they'll feel like they might not actually be able to connect with those people because they're not officially dyslexic. So that's also something to keep in mind. And the final point, or the final 2 points, that I had was that it can't really hurt, even if they turn out to be not dyslexic, it can't really hurt to have them diagnosed, unless you think that process is going to be quite traumatic for the child. It can't really hurt. And the other thing is that it also maps out strengths as well as weaknesses. So if you're struggling to identify your child's strengths, or they're not really aware of what their strengths are, sitting down and having a look at that report and saying, hey, you've actually, you've done really well in some of these areas, let's, really build on those, can be a really, really helpful thing. So we're heading over to the no column now. Some parents don't want to label their children, and that's perfectly okay. It's fundamentally your choice, but that they usually do that mostly for the child's sake, because they don't want to have that sort of label on their child, but it also might be coming from sort of comparison to other people's children. So if you have that diagnosis of dyslexia, you might be scared of how other parents might react or something like that, so that might be an issue for you. The second thing is that some parents wouldn't want their child to use it as an excuse. So, well, I'm not going to try hard in my reading because I'm dyslexic and I can't do it. That's fair enough, but from my experience in meeting many dyslexic people and dyslexic young people as well, I would suggest to you that that's probably not the case. I don't think I've ever heard of a child really using it as an excuse. Most of the time they're trying to hide it or working really hard to try and hide it even more. So I wouldn't necessarily be worried about that one. I'm not sure that that's very prevalent. I guess one of the main ones would be that parents don't want their children to look really different to other children, or for that to really kind of harm their child emotionally, you know, knowing that actually there is a difference between you and neurotypical people. That might be a factor. But I think it's also important to note that, you know, you don't have to tell anyone if you don't want to. That's also your choice who you tell. And it doesn't have to be a huge thing, you know, and I think that first conversation that you have with your child if they are diagnosed is super important. If you sort of sit them down and make it a huge deal, they're gonna think it's a huge deal. So I might do another video on how to break the news a bit later on. And that sort of leads me into the final reason of why you might not diagnose your child or tell your child, and that is that you might be a little bit scared of what their reaction will be. I've had a few parents sort of say that they're a little bit uneasy about how to sort of break the news, and I think it's really important that you know, the more comfortable you are with it, the more comfortable you are yourself with having a child that is dyslexic, the more comfortable they are going to be with it. So your reaction is also really important. Now, there's sort of all the reasons that I've brainstormed. If you've got your own, feel free to comment. I'd love to hear sort of other people's perspectives on this, whether you've had a good experience or a bit of a negative experience like mine sort of a little bit was. You know, I sort of had a bit of a breakdown there, but would love to hear about your diagnosis experience. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe and like the video, or leave a comment, like I said before, about your own sort of diagnosis story. We actually reached over 100 subscribers the other day, which I know might seem very pitiful to some of you, but that made me really excited. Even if I'm helping 100 of you out there, I feel like I'm doing a really good job. So please subscribe, show your support, and we'll see you next time.